In the year 357 BCE, Philip II initiated a decisive strategic shift by turning his attention eastward to consolidate his authority along the crucial Macedonian coastline. His first major objective was the capture of Amphipolis, a city of immense strategic value due to its command over the crossing of the Strymon River and its role as the gateway to the interior of the country. By seizing Amphipolis, Philip not only secured a vital military choke point, but also gained control over the region's rich natural resources, specifically its abundant timber and deposits of precious metals. Upon securing the city, he immediately solidified his hold by installing a garrison, ensuring that this new acquisition would remain firmly within the Macedonian sphere of influence. Shortly thereafter, he continued his aggressive expansion by attacking Pydna, a significant port city on the Macedonian coast. This aggression provoked a declaration of war from the Athenians, who occupied Pydna at the time and maintained historical claims over Amphipolis. However, Philip countered the Athenian declaration with a shrewd diplomatic maneuver. He approached the Chalcidian League and forged an alliance by promising to hand over the Athenian clerici of Potidæa to them, effectively driving a wedge between his potential enemies. The planned transfer of Potidæa was scheduled for 356 BCE, but while Philip was still engaged in the siege of that town, his attention was diverted by an urgent appeal for assistance from Chaeroneides. This Greek colony, situated in the hinterland of Neapolis, modern-day Kavala, found itself under imminent threat from a local Thracian king. Seizing the opportunity to expand his influence, Philip intervened, garrisoned the town, and refounded it under the new name of Philippi. This masterstroke provided Philip with more than just a military foothold in the east. It granted him direct access to the lucrative gold and silver deposits of Mount Pangaeum. Consequently, the Thracian king, whose territory included Philippi, was forced to join Philip's coalition, and by the end of the year, this king had been reduced to the status of a vassal, extending Macedonian rule as far as the Nestus River. In the autumn of 355 BCE, Philip turned his military focus toward Methone, Athens' last remaining stronghold on the Macedonian shoreline. After a prolonged and difficult siege, he forced the city to surrender. This victory was significant not only in material terms, but also as a public relations triumph. Despite the end of the social war, giving Athens the means to intervene, they failed to send aid to Methone, exposing their weakness and lack of resolve. Encouraged by this success, Philip launched a new offensive in the spring of 353 BCE, operating east of the Nestus River. This campaign was likely designed to harass the Greek coastal cities allied with Athens and to intimidate the Thracian ruler of the region. The results of this limited operation appear to have emboldened Philip further, for in the autumn of 352 BCE, he returned to Thrace with a larger objective. Marching rapidly across the Hebrus River, he moved against Cerspleps, the ruler of the easternmost of the three Thracian kingdoms. Philip's lightning campaign forced Cerspleps to submit and accept the status of a vassal. It remains unclear whether this expedition ultimately intended to target the strategic Athenian territories on the Thracian Chersonese, as Philip fell suddenly ill, compelling him to abort the campaign and withdraw. While these military activities were primarily aimed at safeguarding and expanding the Macedonian kingdom, targeting Athens only insofar as it was necessary among the Greek states. The events that transpired between these Thracian campaigns laid the groundwork for Philip's eventual dominance over Central Greece. Historically, the energetic kings of the Argead dynasty had struggled to achieve three primary geopolitical goals: to subjugate the independent rulers of Upper Macedonia, to reach the mouth of the Strymon River to secure the mineral-rich Bisaltia region and prevent Athenian encroachment on their coasts, and to extend Macedonian influence south into Thessaly. Philip achieved the first two of these historical imperatives with remarkable speed. He surpassed his predecessors not only by bringing the territories of Upper Macedonia firmly under his control, but also by pushing the kingdom's western frontier all the way to Lake Ohrid. In the east, he expanded well beyond the Strymon to the Nestus, thereby monopolizing the precious metal wealth of both the Pangaeum and the Bisaltia. With his northern and eastern borders secure and his treasury growing, Philip turned his attention to the third great objective, establishing authority in Thessaly. Philip skillfully exploited the internal strife of the region, intervening in the conflict between the aristocratic Aleuadi family of Larissa and the Thessalian League on one side, and the tyrants of Phaerae on the other. His first intervention occurred as early as 358 BCE, securing the loyalty of his new allies among the Thessalian nobility. He returned in 355 BCE to support the Thessalian League once more, facilitating their entry into a joint sacred war with the Thebans against the Phocians, who had occupied the sanctuary of Delphi for over a year with impunity. It appears that Philip possessed a clear strategic foresight, understanding that involvement in the turbulent politics of central Greece would provide him with a legitimate pretext to intervene personally in Hellenic affairs. This influence, once established, could then be leveraged as a powerful weapon against his primary rival, Athens. However, the intensity of the sacred war temporarily waned in the autumn of 354 BCE, creating a lull in the conflict. Perceiving no immediate opportunity to intervene effectively in central Greece at that moment, Philip turned his attention back to the northern frontier, launching a campaign into Thrace in the spring of 353 BCE. It was during this diversion that the volatile situation in central Greece finally shifted in a direction favorable to Macedonian interests, sparked by a resurgence of aggression from the Phocians under the capable leadership of Onimarchus, and a reignition of the bitter feud between the Thessalian League and the tyrants of Phaerae. In desperation, the tyrants allied themselves with the Phocians, while the Thessalians appealed once more to Philip for deliverance. Initially, Philip's intervention met with limited success. Indeed, he suffered two significant military defeats at the hands of Onimarchus and was compelled to retreat to Macedonia to regroup. Undeterred, he returned in 352 BCE with a reinforced army and, after having the supreme command of the Thessalian League's forces formally transferred to him, he decisively routed Onimarchus in a battle that shattered Phocian power. Shortly thereafter, the city of Phaerae and its strategic port, Pagasae, fell to Philip, bringing a permanent end to the local tyranny. Capitalizing on this momentum, it would have been a logical next step for Philip to utilize his military victories to legitimize his new role as the supreme commander of Thessaly by marching south to the pass of Thermopylae, held by the Phocians, to deliver a final, crushing blow to the sacrilegious temple robbers. Yet, the conflict had evolved beyond a mere regional dispute involving Philip, the Thessalians, Thebans, and Phocians. The prospect of Philip controlling Thermopylae, the gateway to the south, alarmed the other Greek powers, leading to the rapid formation of a coalition defense. Upon arriving, Philip found the pass heavily defended by a united force of Phocians, Athenians, Achaeans, and Spartans, alongside the deposed tyrants of Phaerae and their mercenaries. Confronted by this formidable blockade, Philip pragmatically chose to withdraw rather than force a costly engagement, effectively leaving the warring factions of central Greece to exhaust one another in a protracted conflict that would ultimately serve as long-term advantage. Following his withdrawal from Thermopylae, Philip turned his focus for several years to pressing issues in the north, specifically addressing the geopolitical landscape in Thrace and Epirus, and reassessing his deteriorating relationship with the Chalcidian League. Once a useful ally in his early struggles against Athens, the League had gradually become an alien and obstructive element within the rapidly expanding Macedonian Empire. The League's leadership committed a fatal strategic error by signaling their insubordination and attempting to align themselves with hostile powers, providing Philip with the justification he needed to intervene aggressively. This culminated in the brutal campaign of 348 BCE, which resulted in the total destruction of Olynthus, the dissolution of the League itself, and the complete annexation of its territory into the Macedonian state. The Athenians, who had belatedly realized the danger and sealed a military alliance with the Chalcidians in the summer of 349 BCE, proved unable to provide sufficient aid to save the city or the League from annihilation. Throughout these turbulent years, the Athenians failed to achieve any significant military victories against Philip. Conversely, Philip adopted a strategy of calculated restraint. He not only refrained from launching all-out offensives against Athens, but also repeatedly signaled his willingness to negotiate, offering clear indications of his desire for peace. Although his direct military activities in Greece decreased noticeably after 352 BCE, he never abandoned his ultimate objective of securing a decisive influence over the region. He simply could afford to wait for the right moment. That moment arrived when the Phocians finally admitted defeat in 346 BCE and surrendered directly to him. It was largely due to Philip's intervention that the terms of their capitulation were less draconian than those demanded by other members of the Amphictyonic League. Philip was thus able to present himself as the arbiter of Central Greek affairs, a position solidified by his acquisition of the 2 Phocian votes in the Amphictyonic Council, which, when combined with the votes of the Thessalians and their neighbors, guaranteed him a lasting and dominant influence in the region. Shortly before these events, in the spring of 346 BCE, the Peace of Philocrates was concluded with Athens on the basis of the status quo, a term that required Athens to formally concede the loss of Amphipolis and other coastal territories. In exchange, Philip guaranteed their continued possession of the Thracian Chersonese, a region vital for Athens' grain supply and survival. Yet, even while these peace negotiations were underway at Pella, Philip demonstrated his military reach by launching a surprise campaign against Cerspleps, forcing the Thracian king into vassalage once again. This maneuver served as a stark reminder to the Athenians that Philip was within striking distance of the Chersonese, making his eventual agreement to the peace terms appear as an act of calculated generosity despite his overwhelming military superiority. However, the diplomatic equilibrium established by the peace of 346 BCE soon proved unstable, as it became apparent that Philip's expectations were overly optimistic. He could not simultaneously expand his hegemony over Greece and maintain cordial relations with the Athenians, who viewed his rise as an existential threat. Ostensibly, Philip spent the ensuing years limiting his operations to the consolidation of his northern dominion. In 345 BCE, he led a punitive campaign against the Illyrians to secure his western flank, followed by military operations in Thessaly in 344 BCE to reinforce his authority there. By the winter of 343 to 342 BCE, he had moved into Epirus, where he captured several Greek coastal cities and handed them over to the local ruler, thereby binding Epirus more tightly to the Macedonian cause. Furthermore, he implemented sweeping administrative reforms in Thessaly, effectively reorganizing the region to allow for tighter, more direct control. Having thus methodically secured the south, Thessaly, the southwest, Epirus, and the northwest, the Illyrian border, the stage was finally set for Philip to launch his ambitious and extensive Thracian campaign of 342 to 341 BCE. South of Thessaly, Philip adopted a policy of territorial containment, refraining from direct annexation while aggressively expanding his sphere of political influence. Throughout this period, he maintained a complex diplomatic posture toward Athens, continuously courting their favor and striving to avoid open conflict despite the underlying tensions. This conciliatory approach was put to the test in the autumn of 346 BCE, when the Athenians displayed a distinct lack of cooperation. Despite their formal alliance with Macedonia, they refused to contribute troops to his campaign against the Phocians, abstained from sending a representative to the Amphictyonic Council, and offered a severe diplomatic insult by failing to send an official delegation to the Pythian Games, which were being celebrated under Philip's presidency for the first time. Given the Athenians' persistent pro-Phocian stance during the grueling 10-year Sacred War and the hostile sentiment prevalent among the other Amphictyonic members, Philip would have been well within his rights to sanction a new Sacred War, this time directed against Athens itself. However, displaying remarkable restraint and strategic foresight, Philip not only abstained from military retaliation, but actively used his influence to secure a resolution from the Amphictyonic Council that protected Athenian interests, shielding them from the wrath of their Greek neighbors. Conversely, in 344 BCE, Philip engaged in proxy warfare in the Peloponnese by providing financial support and mercenaries to the enemies of Sparta, a move that alarmed Athens and prompted them to dispatch a counter-delegation led by the orator Demosthenes to rally opposition against Macedonian interference. This dual strategy illustrates the profound diplomatic dilemma Philip faced, which ultimately compelled him to fundamentally alter his approach to Greek politics. Establishing a durable understanding with the Athenians proved nearly impossible after years of military and diplomatic blows had eroded mutual trust. Furthermore, Philip's inevitable efforts to consolidate his hegemony over Greece naturally cast a shadow over his relations with Athens, as every move to strengthen his hand was viewed with suspicion by the Athenian democracy, hindering any genuine rapprochement. Philip initially attempted to bridge this divide through diplomacy, offering in the winter of 344/3 BCE to renegotiate and revise the terms of the peace treaty of 346 BCE. However, these negotiations collapsed due to the exaggerated and unrealistic demands put forth by the Athenian assembly. In response to this diplomatic failure, Philip shifted tactics in 343 BCE, firing a warning shot across Athens' bow by intervening in the internal affairs of key cities, Elis, Megara, and Euboea, the latter two being dangerously close to Attica's borders. Following this display of reach, he approached Athens once more in early 342 BCE with a renewed offer to improve relations. When this overture was also summarily rebuffed, Philip finally accepted the reality that a decisive military confrontation was unavoidable. Determined to dictate the terms of this coming conflict, he launched a massive campaign to conquer Thrace, aiming to transform the region from a loose dependency into a fully annexed territory, extending all the way to the Straits. Controlling this vital corridor would allow him to strangle the Athenian grain supply and bring the city to its knees. However, the conquest of Thrace was driven by geopolitical concerns that extended beyond the suppression of Athens. The international landscape was shifting. In 344 BCE, the Persian great king Artaxerxes III had recovered Cyprus, followed by the reconquest of Phoenicia in 343 BCE, and intelligence reaching Pella suggested an imminent Persian campaign to retake Egypt. While the Persian Empire had not posed a direct threat to Macedonia in recent decades, its resurgence and consolidation threatened to fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Aegean. Philip recognized that a revitalized Persian Empire might seek to reassert itself in the West, and by expanding his authority up to the Hellespont and the Bosporus, he intended to create a buffer against potential Persian encroachment. By the summer of 341 BCE, the military conquest of Thrace was largely complete, yet Philip appears to have remained in the region through the following winter, meticulously implementing administrative structures to ensure the permanent integration of these new territories into the Macedonian realm. Philip was not alone in the realization that a final showdown was imminent, though he viewed the prospect with reluctance. In Athens, Demosthenes had also concluded that war was the only solution, but unlike the Macedonian king, he actively and purposefully agitated for it. Through inflammatory rhetoric and diplomatic maneuvering, Demosthenes succeeded in intensifying the hostilities, culminating in the spring of 340 BCE with the formation of a Hellenic League explicitly directed against Philip. This alliance, ostensibly defensive, united a formidable coalition including Athens, the cities of Euboea, Megara, and Corinth, along with its colonies Leucas and Corcyra, as well as the regions of Achaea and Acarnania. Meanwhile, Philip directed his forces against the city of Perynthus. However, he found himself unable to breach its defenses, largely because the city received substantial support not only from the Byzantines, but also from the Persian satrap Statio, Ned on the Asiatic shore of the Propontis, marking a direct interference by Persia in Philip's wars. In the autumn of 340 BCE, attempting to break the deadlock, Philip detached a portion of his army to launch a raid on Byzantium. Operating in the nearby waters was the Athenian general Chares, whose primary mission was to escort the vital grain fleets traveling from the Black Sea to Athens. When Chares temporarily left his station to confer with Persian generals, evidence of the growing anti-Macedonian collaboration between Athens and Persia, Philip seized the moment. With the grain fleet vulnerable and assembled, the temptation was too great to resist. He struck decisively, capturing the fleet during Chares' absence. This aggressive maneuver yielded immense booty, but, more importantly, it was a deliberate provocation that made an Athenian declaration of war inevitable. Philip surely calculated this outcome. The seizure was likely intended either to force Athens into a disadvantageous battle or to demonstrate their total naval inferiority and vulnerability to starvation. Following this incident, Philip continued his operations against Byzantium, but the city was now bolstered by direct Athenian military aid, forcing Philip to abandon the siege in early 339 BC. Rather than marching immediately against Athens, he turned north to secure his rear, campaigning against the Scythians near the Danube Delta to protect his new Thracian conquests. After settling matters there, he began his return to Macedonia through the hostile territory of the Triballians. It was during this return march that a fateful call for assistance reached him from his allies in central Greece, setting the stage for the final act of the conflict. For Philip, despite his distraction in the north, had certainly not erased the Athenians from his strategic calculus. Indeed, realizing that they had thus far failed to mobilize a broad coalition of allies against him, he initiated a diplomatic offensive intended to isolate them completely by maneuvering the Amphictyonic Council into condemning them. The specific allegation brought against Athens was selected with diabolical cleverness. It concerned the dedication of golden shields and votive offerings at the temple of Apollo in Delphi, which the Athenians had installed before the temple was formally reconsecrated following the Phocian War. These offerings bore an inscription commemorating their victory over the Persians and Thebans in 479 BCE, a deliberate reminder of Thebes' historical betrayal of the Greek cause, Medizing. This act was technically a sacrilege due to the timing, but its political intent was to goad the Thebans. Philip calculated that the council, dominated by his own votes and those of his Thessalian allies, would impose a crippling fine on Athens. When Athens inevitably refused to pay, the Thebans would be compelled by religious duty and personal insult to lead a sacred war against them, effectively doing Philip's dirty work while he remained in the background. However, this ingeniously constructed diplomatic trap failed spectacularly due to the unexpected intervention of the Athenian orator Aeschines, who was serving as a representative to the council at Delphi. Rather than submitting to the accusation, Aeschines deflected the anger of the Amphictyons by launching a blistering counteraccusation against the Locrians of Amphissa, charging them with cultivating the sacred Syrian plain, an act strictly forbidden by religious law. His rhetoric was so effective that the council's fury was redirected entirely toward Amphissa, igniting a new sacred war that followed a trajectory completely different from what Philip had orchestrated. The Thebans, whom Philip had intended to use as his proxy hammer against Athens, refused to cooperate with this new turn of events. Instead of attacking Athens, they threw their support behind the Amphictyons and, in a bold strategic move, seized control of the pass at Thermopylae. This action blocked the Amphictyonic forces from marching south to punish Amphissa, creating a military stalemate that the council could not resolve on its own. Consequently, in the autumn of 339 BCE, the Amphictyons were forced to issue a formal appeal to Philip, who had just returned from his Danube campaign, to assume command and enforce the will of the god Apollo. Thus, the conflict in central Greece, a war Philip had initially tried to avoid through diplomacy, then found himself compelled to fight, and even then sought to avert by repeatedly offering terms of negotiation, finally erupted in full force. Despite Philip's continued overtures for a peaceful settlement, the momentum for war among the Greek states, driven by the frantic diplomacy of Demosthenes in Athens, was unstoppable. The inevitable military resolution arrived at the beginning of August 338 BCE, on the plains of Chaeroneia, where the Macedonian phalanx and cavalry delivered a crushing and unequivocal victory over the allied Greek forces. With the coalition shattered and the flower of the Theban and Athenian armies destroyed, Philip was once again the undisputed master of the battlefield, free to dictate the new order of the Greek world and to set the stage for his long-planned pan-Hellenic enterprise against Persia. The settlement imposed upon Thebes, his former ally who had defected to the coalition at the 11th hour, was severe and calculated to permanently break its power. Philip installed a Macedonian garrison in the Cadmea, the citadel of Thebes, effectively stripping the city of its sovereignty. Furthermore, he ordered the recall of pro-Macedonian political exiles, which resulted in an immediate regime change that placed his partisans in power. While Philip did not dissolve the Boeotian League, he fundamentally altered its balance of power. The Thebans were stripped of their hegemony over Boeotia, and to ensure they could never rise again, Philip undertook the symbolic and strategic refounding of cities like Plataea, Thespiae, and Orchomenus, cities that Thebes had brutally destroyed during its period of dominance. All these measures were designed with a singular purpose: to reduce Thebes from a major land power to a humbled municipality, hemmed in and policed by hostile neighbors who owed their restoration to Philip. In stark contrast to the harsh treatment of Thebes, Athens was treated with surprising leniency. Although the Athenians had been the architects of the coalition against him, and despite Demosthenes' years of vitriolic rhetoric and attempts to sabotage Macedonian interests, Philip chose to act with restraint. In Philip's view, while the Athenians were deeply culpable for the war, he recognized their cultural prestige and the necessity of their naval power for his future plans. Consequently, he did not impose a garrison on the city. He refrained from invading Attica, and he left the democratic constitution untouched despite his negative experiences with its volatility. Moreover, Athens was permitted to retain its overseas cleriches, Lemnos, Imbris, Skyros, and Samos, losing only the Thracian Chersonese. However, the cession of the Chersonese was a masterstroke of strategic control. Because Athens was entirely dependent on grain imports from the Black Sea, Philip's control of the Hellespont meant that the city effectively existed on Macedonian sufferance, liable to starvation should they ever rebel again. To finalize their neutralization as a military threat, the Second Athenian Confederacy was formally dissolved, stripping Athens of its imperial ambitions and leaving it isolated. Regarding the fate of other Greek states, the historical record is sparse, particularly concerning those who fought at Chaeroneia, but the pattern of Philip's settlement is clear. Key strategic locations were secured to ensure the stability of the new Macedonian hegemony. In addition to the garrison at Thebes, Philip placed garrisons in Corinth and Ambracia. These three fortified positions constituted the fetters of Greece. The garrison in the Cadmea controlled central Greece and the aggressive Thebans. The garrison in Corinth, stationed on the imposing Acrocorinth, locked down the isthmus and guaranteed the submission of the Peloponnese, and the garrison in Ambracia secured the northwest, driving a wedge between the rising powers of Epirus and Aetolia, allies whom Philip had promoted but evidently did not fully trust. In other city-states, direct intervention was unnecessary, as the shock of the defeat at Chaeroneia naturally precipitated internal political shifts, bringing pro-Macedonian factions to power who were eager to align themselves with the new master of Greece. These measures, implemented in the immediate aftermath of the decisive victory at Chaeroneia, reveal a striking divergence in how peace was administered, with the treatment of Philip's former adversaries often appearing strangely disproportionate to their actual culpability in the war. A similar pattern of calculated geopolitical engineering is evident in Philip's reorganization of the Peloponnese. While members of the hostile coalition in the northern part of the peninsula were treated with relative leniency, Sparta, which had remained ostensibly neutral during the conflict, was singled out for significant punitive measures. Philip stripped the Spartans of key frontier territories and handed them over to their traditional enemies: Messenia, Megalopolis, Tegea, and Argos. The strategic intent behind this was not to annihilate Sparta entirely, but rather to weaken it permanently by empowering its neighbors at its expense. By creating a ring of strengthened states around Laconia, Philip ensured that no single power could rise to achieve hegemony over the Peloponnese. Furthermore, because these states owed their new territorial acquisitions solely to Philip's decree, they were bound to him by necessity, serving as loyal watchdogs who could never forget that their security against a vengeful Sparta depended entirely on Macedonian support. Through these meticulously crafted arrangements, Philip ensured that the three traditional great powers of the Greek world, Thebes, Sparta, and Athens, would never again possess the capacity to challenge his supremacy or compete with Macedonia for leadership. All three were systematically neutralized, though the methods employed varied according to the nature of their power. The Thebans were shackled by a forced change in government, a Macedonian garrison in the Chaeroneia, and the restoration of rival Boeotian cities to check their regional dominance. The Spartans were crippled by territorial amputation and the constant pressure of hostile, Macedonian-backed neighbors. And the Athenians were contained by the loss of the strategic Thracian Chersonese and the final dissolution of the remnants of their second confederacy. However, the disparity in treatment becomes most glaring when comparing what was taken from the land powers versus the sea power. Thebes and Sparta, whose strength lay in their armies and territory, were physically diminished and occupied. In contrast, the Athenians, whose true might lay in their navy, were permitted to retain their fleet, a concession that is all the more remarkable given that Philip possessed no naval force capable of matching it. This conspicuously sparing treatment of Athens has long puzzled historians, inviting various interpretations regarding Philip's ultimate motives. The most compelling explanation is that Philip deliberately preserved the Athenian fleet because he intended to integrate it into his own grand strategy for a future war against the Persian Empire. This hypothesis provides a logical framework for understanding his persistent diplomatic courtship of Athens from 348 BCE onward, as well as the notable forbearance he displayed toward the city even before the final showdown at Chaeroneia. If Philip's ambition extended beyond Greece to Asia, he would have recognized that while Macedonia provided an invincible army, it lacked a navy. Destroying the Athenian fleet would have deprived him of the very tool he needed to challenge Persian naval supremacy in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. This raises the critical question of when exactly the concept of a pan-Hellenic invasion of the Persian Empire became a central pillar of Philip's policy and began to dictate his actions on the southern Balkan Peninsula. The historical sources first explicitly mention a Persian campaign in the context of the year 346 BCE, though this reference comes from Diodorus Siculus, a later historian. After recounting the conclusion of the Phocian War, Diodorus states that Philip harbored a desire to be appointed as the commander-in-chief of the Greeks for a war against the Persians. While it is possible that Diodorus, or his source, was projecting Philip's later achievements backward in time, the notion of planning a war against the great king in 346 BCE was by no means unrealistic. The geopolitical landscape of the Persian Empire at that time, as described by the orator Isocrates in his open letter to Philip in the summer of that same year, suggested a vulnerability that an ambitious conqueror could exploit. Isocrates wrote with the specific intent of persuading Philip to lead a united Greek expedition against the East, a proposal he would not have made had he not believed it to be a feasible undertaking given the power dynamics in the Aegean and the internal instability of the Persian realm. Furthermore, the idea of a pan-Hellenic crusade was not a novel concept introduced by Isocrates in 346. He had been publicly advocating for such an enterprise for decades. As early as 380 BCE, in his famous Panegyricus, Isocrates had lobbied passionately for the Greeks to reconcile their internecine differences and unite in a war against their ancestral enemy. The fact that he published such a pamphlet suggests that he believed his contemporaries would view a war against the great king as a distinct possibility rather than a fantasy. Indeed, the feasibility of such an invasion was understood by pragmatic military leaders of the era, including Jason of Pheræ, the tyrant who established himself as the strongest power in central Greece during the late 370s. Jason, who must have been among the readers of Isocrates' work, was widely credited with the ambition to march against the Persian Empire. The historical authenticity of Jason's ambition is corroborated not only by Isocrates' later references, but also by Xenophon, a contemporary observer who recorded Jason's rationale. In Xenophon's Hellenica, Jason argues that subjugating the Persian king would actually be an easier task than subjugating Greece, citing the military lessons of the recent past. You are surely aware that the Persian king too owes being the richest man in the world to income not from the islands but from the mainland. To make him a subject of mine is a plan which I believe to be able to realize more easily than to subject Hellas to me. For I know by what kind of army, and this is true as much for Cyrus' troops during his march inland as for those of Agesilaus. The Persian king has already been brought to the verge of ruin.